Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time I'm going to try to answer several questions in a more rapid fire style. And let's kick it off with this one from Cheesehead Caleb, who asked, "Hey Thor, I had a question regarding assumed dead characters being resurrected. How would you articulate to someone why a character like Mace Windu being brought back from the apparent dead is still bad for the story overall, even though if you really think about it, him surviving the events of Episode 3 isn't the most unrealistic thing Star Wars has done. The recent Samuel L. Jackson comments on Windu being alive really bothered me, but I've been unable to clearly argue as to why when talking to people who are glad that it's the case." Okay, so though I do for the most part agree that there's a chance, maybe a fairly decent chance, that Windu could have survived everything that happened to him, the losing an arm, the getting hit by Force lightning, and then the fall. Sadly, I don't think that would be the most unbelievable Star Wars comeback ever. But the problem with it, for me at least, or how I try to articulate what I think the problem with it is that it isn't just that it's become a meme at this point for characters to come back from the dead in Star Wars, that no one's ever really gone, or that somehow this character has returned. My problem is that characters coming back from the dead, and I don't mean in like Force Ghost form, but literally still being alive or coming back to life after being presumed dead, is that it kind of goes against the very idea of Star Wars itself. It almost kind of defeats the purpose of it. I mean, never mind the fact that the plot of Revenge of the Sith is basically Anakin trying to save his wife from dying, and he falls to the dark side because of that. Not that there weren't other factors as well. But when you really try to sum up what Star Wars is all about, what is the big underlying message to it all, and yeah, you could argue there's many of them. Star Wars certainly has a lot to say about a lot of different things or aspects of life, which is one of the reasons I enjoy it so much. But one of the biggest takeaways, especially again when it comes to the prequels or the story of Anakin Skywalker, is that decisions and or the actions that follow have consequences. The choices we make in life matter and impact ourselves and others. And you can't just undo things when you make a mistake or when something bad happens. Life isn't about being perfect, it's about making mistakes and what you learn from them or how you respond to them to hopefully better yourself and not repeat those mistakes. And yeah, sometimes you screw up pretty big and you can only try to find a way to live with it, or maybe you get consumed by it, or maybe you try to seek redemption for it. And so when something like death doesn't feel like it matters all that much in Star Wars, when you keep bringing characters back from it in one way or another, it kind of cheapens that core or fundamental message about how there are consequences and that things can't just be undone. Like it or not, but certain things in life must be accepted, even if you don't really like them, like death. And there's a reason why part of the story is the Sith seeking to cheat death and to want to live forever, because they're the ones who refuse to accept these sort of things and will do whatever, like willingly hurt other people, to get what they want or to live forever. So yeah, that's my biggest problem with characters coming back from the dead in Star Wars. But now let's move on to this comment from Jared Locke, who asked, "Hey Thor, if George Lucas had ideas for the events outside of the 6-film saga, why didn't he do anything with them? Why sit on your hands and let other creators develop stories under your IP you don't agree with? Why do you think we never got the full Lucas version of Star Wars? I imagine it would be very different from what we have now." And my guess here, and this is only a guess, but my guess is that George Lucas never really intended to do that much with Star Wars. He never intended it to be his life's work, essentially. I mean, no one could have predicted the success Star Wars was going to have. No one would predict it was going to be this cultural phenomena. And so the reason why others are allowed to come in and work on it is because, for one, you can make a lot of money off that, right? And for two, it allows people to have more Star Wars. The people who want more Star Wars can have it more than he could ever provide, because he just, again, it's not that he didn't like Star Wars or doesn't love Star Wars or doesn't want to do it, but I don't think he wanted to just sit down and make his whole life about Star Wars. Also, I don't think he cares as much about the canon and consistency as we would want to believe he does. I think he is more about how can I use Star Wars to tell the stories I want to tell, rather than how can I create more Star Wars and make this a bigger galaxy, if that makes sense. And so others could come in and give people what they wanted. They could expand this galaxy, they could create these stories that would form this canon. Now, even the EU isn't always consistent. But yeah, that's basically what I think it is. I don't think George Lucas ever intended to spend his whole life making Star Wars. It was a happy accident, shall we say, that it became as big as it did. Though that said, in hindsight, I don't know that he wouldn't want to now, say, finish his story. I don't know that he wouldn't go back in time and undo the sale to Disney and then finish his story first, because he did have plans for a sequel trilogy. Which kind of brings us to this question from Cursed Flesh 36, who asked, "Hey Thor, I've had the idea for a little while now that Lucasfilm should pursue adapting George Lucas's sequel treatments in comic form and getting Lucas himself to consult on it. This may sound like an out there idea, but Lucas was clearly unhappy that the story of his sequels was never told. He's had a lifelong love of comic books as a medium, and even though he's retired, he's always been happy to consult on projects whenever Lucasfilm has asked him to. Solo, The Mandalorian, Dial of Destiny, etc. For Lucasfilm's part, they're fine with producing non-canonical content like Visions and the rumored What If series. Marvel Comics has also just announced they'll be publishing What If Alien comics, and Dark Horse recently published a comic adaptation of one of James Cameron's old drafts for an Avatar sequel. So I don't see why Lucasfilm can't get either company to give Star Wars the same treatment. It could even be a nice way to celebrate the upcoming 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the sequel trilogy, taking a look at what it could have been. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's an idea Lucasfilm should pursue? I think it is absolutely something Lucasfilm should pursue, but it is absolutely something they won't. And the reason I think it is something they should do is because, well, fans would love to know what George Lucas's idea for the sequel trilogies were, right? We would all love to hear it, even if we don't necessarily like what we get. We know he was going to go into the microbiotic realm. We know Darth Talon and Darth Maul were going to be the villains, talking about characters coming back from the dead again. So there are a lot of things to either be leery about or maybe not like, or maybe be really excited about, I don't know. But the reason why I don't think Lucasfilm will do this is because if the comic book comes out or the series comes out and it's actually really, really good, if fans are like, wow, this was incredible, this is what the sequel trilogy should have been, well, then it just makes people not like the sequels even more. It makes them even more resentful towards Disney for not letting Lucas finish his story, or not using Lucas's treatments, or bringing him in to consult more, or whatever else it might be. It's kind of a lose-lose situation. Either they're printed and nobody cares and they're terrible, or they're actually really, really good and people are like, you guys really messed up and should have gone with what Lucas had in mind. Okay, let's now move on to this comment from R. Deathmark, who said, "Hey Thor, how do you square the proverbial circle of the mastermind emperor of the prequels compared to the blunt instrument that he seems to become in the OT?" I think this is an example of Star Wars always evolving. I don't think George Lucas had as much figured out back initially as some people want to give him credit for, or maybe even he kind of claims he did. He talks a lot about how he had the story figured out. But even in the original trilogy itself, things were changing and progressing. For example, Leia becoming Luke's sister, or Darth Vader becoming Luke's father. These were things that were not initially part of the story or the idea. And so, not to contradict myself about what I said earlier about Lucas not wanting to make his life Star Wars, but certainly in the 16 years between the end of the original trilogy and the start of the prequels, he had a lot of ideas for the story of the prequels. A lot of things came to him, and somewhere along the way, turning the prequels into partially the story of the rise of Palpatine was one of them. Certainly he realized there was a lot to say about, as I discussed in a video the other day, about how democracies fall, and Palpatine was the perfect way to do that. And so yeah, back in the day of the original trilogy, the Emperor just being kind of this big figurehead worked just fine, but then he realized there was a lot more I could do with this character, and that's what he did. Alright, and speaking of Palpatine, we now have this comment from Sarah Cook, who asked, "Hey Thor, I have a sort of follow-up question to this video. There have been a few sources, including Lucas himself, that have confirmed that Palpatine believes he is in the right. Why do you think so many fans act like he's only after power and nothing more? One of the issues in all of this is that the bad guy thinks they're good, and Lord Sidious thinks he's bringing peace to the galaxy because there's so much corruption and confusion and chaos going on, and that now he's going to be able to straighten everything out, which may be true, but the price the galaxy is going to have to pay for it is way too much." And that is a quote from George Lucas from the Revenge of the Sith commentary. And then we also have this one from the Visual Dictionary. "Sidious does not consider himself evil, but rather a savior." I think the problem here is that Palpatine's motivations are really never explored, and it's always kind of assumed, and I think it's right, that Sith seek power for power's sake. And so when you kind of add those two things together, most people just assume, well, he became a Sith because he likes power, or he was corrupted by something, and now he just seeks to have more and more power. And the best way to get more power is to rule the galaxy, and that it doesn't go any further than that, that he doesn't like think to himself, well, I'm doing this for the people, because Sith only think inward and think only for themselves. So there are a lot of things that I think could have been done in the prequels that would have shown his motivations more and led us to believe that he believed he was actually trying to do good for the galaxy. So though I do agree, I think it makes sense that, like most villains, they kind of think they're in the right, or that he is actually doing good. I honestly believe it could have been presented better in the prequels than it was, and then maybe we wouldn't have people who just think he didn't care at all about the galaxy and it was just all about the power. Alright, now let's move on to this question from Suik V, who asked, Hey Thor, with the Old Republic no longer being canon, at least what we see in Legends, and now an upcoming Dawn of the Jedi movie may be kicking off a retelling of that period at some point, do you think they might or should try to incorporate more of the Lucas version of the lore? I think they're going to do the opposite. I think they're going to go all in on what the Old Republic basically did. More Jedi, Sith, large-scale conflicts and war and struggles between these two factions that, date thousands of years. I think that's what most fans actually prefer. I don't think, and I talked about this in the video yesterday, that I don't think many people really like the Lucas version, that it was really a small Sith uprising and they ruled for a little while and then just kind of defeated themselves, and apparently the Jedi didn't really do much in that downfall. So yeah, I think they're actually going to go more of the EU or Legends route with the Old Republic, which makes one ask the question, why try to reinvent the wheel? Why not just say, hey, everything that the Old Republic already is, back in the EU or Legends, whatever the hell you want to call it, that is now the canon, and we're going to add more stories to that because we have thousands upon thousands of years of space to play within. Moving on now, we have a question here from John, who asked, Hey Thor, do you think the final scene in Solo where Maul reveals himself as the leader of Crimson Dawn, was that originally meant to be a clue to the possible sequel trilogy that Lucas originally outlined? I actually think that was more about trying to set up Maul as sort of a villain of this time period for more movies to explore. I think the idea originally was to have a Solo 2, maybe a Lando movie, maybe a Boba Fett movie, and who knows what else, that all kind of tied into Maul being the leader of Crimson Dawn and would eventually see him overthrown and then ending up where we see him in Rebels, where he gets finally killed by Kenobi, we think. Basically, I think they had some pretty big plans for Maul overall that got derailed when Solo was a financial failure and the whole Star Wars anthology or Star Wars story idea changed and, well, basically got discarded. Now let's move on to this one from Lord Mango, who asked, Hey Thor, seeing how popular and well-written some of the Star Wars games are, do you think there might be a chance that we might get some of them adapted into film? Lots of video games are getting adaptations now with great success, so maybe there's a possibility. I don't know that we'll see adaptations of the games turned into movies as much as we'll see characters from the games, mainly Cal Kestis comes to mind, that will appear in shows or maybe even get their own shows or their own movie or something along those lines. I definitely agree the games, the Jedi, Fallen Order, and Survivor games, have been some of the highlights of the Disney era, and that Cameron Monaghan plays a hell of a character and looks a lot like his character, so why not bring him into live action? Why not bring Cal Kestis into live action? Alright, and let's do one final question now, coming from Micah Villa, who asked, Hey Thor, what's your favorite Star Wars board game, or what would you suggest? Sadly, I haven't played too many of them, to be honest, and not out of a lack of a desire or wanting to play them, but out of a lack of having people to play them with. I know there are a lot of really interesting and cool looking board games out there for Star Wars, but again, I don't really know that I want to spend hundreds of dollars to buy some of them or get into them and then have nobody to play with. The last thing like a board game I really got into in terms of Star Wars was the CCG from back in the 90s, and I mainly only collected that because I had a very hard time finding people to play with. Everybody was playing Magic the Gathering back then, including myself. And so, unfortunately, I don't really know that I could recommend a Star Wars board game. I know next month there will be the new collectible card game, Star Wars Unlimited, and I'm very excited about that. I'm interested in checking it out and hopefully finding people to play with. Though that said, I'm already kind of into a card game right now, a TCG card game called Flesh and Blood, which is just amazing. If you've ever played Magic, or if you're playing Magic and you like that sort of thing, I would highly recommend checking it out. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. I don't have an answer to this. I guess I need more friends willing to play Star Wars with me than I currently have. Alright, well that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think of any of the answers to these questions, or answer the questions yourself and tell me what you think about these things. Or, of course, you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video, and I will try to do more of these kind of rapid responses. I get tons of questions, and I always feel bad that I answer like a fraction of the questions I get asked. Anyway, leave those comments below, let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.